G'day people, I'm Sharon. Welcome to my channel. I need a new t-shirt, so I'm making one today. There are 3 small parts of it that are going to be made with the sewing machine, and the rest will be done on the overlocker. Let's get started. I don't normally mark darts, but in this case I have put a pencil line from the top edge of the dart down to the end of the dart. I'm going to fold it right sides together and put it where the dart cutting indicates that the other end of the dart or the other side of the dart is going to be. And I'm going to find the point down here. You can see that's a bit twisty at the moment. What I want to do is to get that untwisty, find myself a nice position, and you can see when doing that the bottom leg of the dart is actually a bit longer than the top leg. Really doesn't matter that much. Don't get too caught up over things being absolutely perfect. That will work fine in the scheme of things. If I really want to, I can stretch it out a little bit at the edge. Needle down. I have increased my stitch length to 3. And here we go. Now, to make sure you don't get one of those ripply bits in the end of your dart, try to make sure you do a couple of stitches that are pretty much on that fold. Lift the needle. I like to then pull it to the back to give myself some extra thread. Go back into the dart, inside it, and do some more stitching. And that little bit of stitching there will stop this from coming undone. And there's my dart. It's not perfect, but then my body's not perfect either. I did the 2 darts and then onto the overlocker to do the centre back seam. I'm going to start at the bottom of the back, centre back, and as I sew this seam, I'm going to just take off the slightest bit of fabric at the edge. Now I'm noticing as this comes out of the back that it's very, very slightly wavy. So I'm going to increase my differential feed. If you've watched my video on differential feed, you'll understand why I'm doing that. So now I have a back with a seam in it. Why do I have a centre back seam in my t-shirt? It's because I've got some shaping in there that makes it fit me better. Right sides together, I've got the back there, and I put this shoulder seam together. I need to get them exactly matching at the shoulder. You'll notice I'm not pinning because there is a lot of this that if you pin, you actually make it harder for yourself. I'm going to lay these together and sew along here. So I'm going from the shoulder point in to the neck, and as I get a little further, you'll see that I've got the front poking out a bit from underneath the back. And that is because the places to match up are not the edges where it's cut, but here where the stitching is going to go. So I want the stitching to come out around about the point where those 2 edges come together. And there's that point. It's not perfect, but it's close enough. Remember, we're going to be moving. There's going to be something covering this over. So when we look at this, they come together pretty close. I sewed the other shoulder seam as well. Also starting at the shoulder edge, which I want nice and even, and working towards the neck, and I can pull it around a bit to get the sewing side of it to come out evenly. My neckline is now all together, and now is also the easiest time for me to finish it off. This is the back, right side up on my machine, and I'm going to use the piece of fabric that I cut. It's about 4 centimeters or 1 3/4 inch wide. Its stretch is in the direction all the way across the fabric, or all the way down this length, and you can see when I stretch it, the fabric then wants to start curling in at the edges. That's because it's a single knit. Double knits are more stable this way. I'm going to fold the end and put it not right on the seam in the middle back, because I don't care what people think about how it looks at the back of my neck. They're probably never really going to see it anyway, but I don't want a big lump of fabric there, which would include the seam and this fold. When you go with your overlocker to get into something like this, and remembering we always want to be cutting something off. My needle has just got into this fabric, and that means that it's not going to shift. From here on in, as I sew around the neckline, I am putting the neckline along the machine, and this piece goes along there, and then it gets stretched slightly. So I'm talking about stretching from there out to the end. So maybe 3/4 of an inch. I don't look at that, I just do it by feel, but I'm going to pick up the fabric and pull it out a bit. Now I'm stopping there because the under fabric was moving off to the side. So now I need to readjust it. I've got to my shoulder seam, and I'm going to turn my shoulder seam towards the back. And I'm doing the same thing. So I've got as much of it as I can in a straight line. And then I'm going to come down to the front and stretch a bit. But I'm only going to sew as far as that seam where things start turning off. And now the needle's down. I need to maybe lift that a bit. I need to straighten this with the machine and do that little bit of pull out. It's got stuck on the shoulder seam, so I'll stop. I've managed to get it off the shoulder seam, but what I'm going to do is readjust everything. So you don't have to just keep sewing, readjust as necessary. Little bit of tension on it. So every time these start to diverge, I need to readjust. Put that little bit of tension on the top fabric. Readjust. I'm getting pretty close to the center front now. So the fabric underneath is turning quite quickly. Readjust. And you can see there's always a bit of fabric being cut off. Back up to the left shoulder seam now, and that's where I didn't quite get things correct, so I'm going to make the adjustment now. A little bit of tension on the fabric, and I'm going to trim that bit off. I'm going to cut here, not all the way through, just far enough that I can do my overlocking. And there's the end of it. So where I cut it off, it completely covers the fold that I made at the start. There are a couple of reasons why I like this particular neckline trim. One of them is whatever shape the neckline is cut to is what you're going to end up with. You're not going to be either going in closer to your neck or taking fabric away and getting bigger. So where it's sitting when you start is pretty much where it sits when you finished. In terms of actually doing it, it's pretty easy. You don't need to calculate how much fabric you need to put around. Just doing that bit of tensioning as you're sewing the binding around works a treat. And because it's all done with the overlocker, you end up with a nice even width all the way around your neckline. Back at the sewing machine, I'm going to do one of my little things that I do to make my life easier. This is the under piece of my binding, and this piece will go over it. Before I worry about this piece, I am going to fold my fabric over the edge of the overlocking and put it in here and stitch in the ditch. You can stitch just on the edge of the fabric if you want, or in the ditch. And you can see I'm having a little bit of a fight with the fabric. It's wanting to twist and turn, but I'm going to win. By doing that, I don't have to worry about what that piece is doing now when I start this one. So I'm folding that over. I'll start stitching a little bit before this piece, and I'm just going to stitch the whole way around in the ditch. If I miss, it's not that big of a deal. So I'm folding it firmly around my overlocking, and because it's firmly around my overlocking, this binding should be pretty even when I'm finished. I am stretching it a little as I go. There is a bit of stretch still in here. I'm not just doing it flat. There is some pulling going on. I'll do a lock stitch. And cut it off. What tends to happen when you're doing this is that there will be some places where you stitch away from the binding edge. The binding tends to want to roll over it anyway, so longer term it doesn't show visibly. And of course, the closer your thread colour is to your fabric, the less it's going to show. To finish off this binding, because I've still got this pile of stuff on the inside that's all curling up and not looking very nice, I just take some scissors and trim it back. And when you first start doing this, you're probably going to worry that you're going to cut a hole in your garment. Takes a little bit to get used to it, but that's all there is to it. 30 seconds of trimming later, and my neckline's finished. I generally use 5 pins to attach my sleeve to my armhole, and I do it at this point when the neckline is completed. 1 pin joins them together at the top seam, 1 at the front where the sleeve seam and the side seam come together, 1 at the back, and then I need to do some adjusting. I don't want things to be stretched around the top, but if they get stretched under my arm, it doesn't matter. So this, I get it down to here, I'll put a pin in there, and that can be stretched a bit. Possibly not that much, but this particular pattern, I don't have markings on the body of where things match up, but I can fiddle it. There's enough fiddle room in these things for you. So mostly you don't want things stretched at the top of the sleeve, but if they need to get stretched at the bottom, that's okay. who's looking under your arm anyway. So I've pinned it on and now I'll sew it. You can see I've also turned all of these pins sideways because I definitely do not ever want to go over a pin with this machine or any of these overlockers. Now remember, I had parts of this that needed to be stretched, so all I'm going to do is go to the point where the pin is and stretch it out. So the bit that needs stretching has now been stretched. And I just keep going. Maybe I'll move the camera a little bit so you can see a bit more of what my hands are doing. Putting it together. Coming up to the top of the, make sure that I've got my seam going in the same direction at each end of the seam. Put the edges together. So I've grabbed it sort of in the middle so that both in front and behind it should be the same amount of stretch. Got stuck on the seam there, so I need to give my machine a bit of encouragement to get over that seam. Now that it's over it, down to the next pin, and finally you can see there's more fabric underneath than on top. I just pull the top fabric out to meet it. Try and keep those edges together because that's the important part. Now that seemed like I was doing a lot of stretching and stuff, but there's the seam afterwards, and you can't see any gathering even though I was pulling things to make them meet. There's no bits where I've had something get a little pleat in it. You can encourage it to stretch together as you're sewing. The second sleeve went in the same way as the first one. People are sometimes scared of stretch sewing, but stretch fabrics are more forgiving than wovens are. They will allow you to give something a bit of a tug, and later you can't really see where you did it. When I'm going to be sewing underarm seams together, so this is the sleeve and this is the body of the garment, and you can see the dart there that's on the front of it. When I put these together, I will put one in one direction and one in the other. And by doing that, it helps to lock the seams together. As the machine comes up to this, it will be pulling that one that's underneath in together and making that a good join. The only other places that I tend to pin these are at the wrist and the hem. And if I really want to, I maybe would put one additional pin at the bust dart so that I make sure that that dart is folded down, because that's the way gravity will want it to go. Starting at the bottom of the side seam. can see how quickly I did that seam, and it is all very stretchy. The other side and sleeve seam were just as easy to do. And then I was up to making cuffs, which means I could avoid doing any hems on the sleeves. In order to make my hems on my sleeves with the overlocker, I cut them about 1 inch short, and I'm going to put a band on the bottom, which will add that extra bit back. Now, if I cut this at exactly the same size, so I need it doubled because my sleeve is already sewn together. If I cut this at exactly the same size, if I then stitched along here and attached it, this is going to be a bit loose. And I don't mean loose on my wrist, it will be that, but I mean it will stretch and you will end up with a band that stretches and is bigger than the sleeve. So I want to make it a bit smaller than this. So I'm going to come in, cut maybe 1/4 inch more off both sides. Now I do hope you can see this is not an exact science. That should work. It'll be enough to pull in the arm a bit without making it gathery, but it won't be too big. So I need to cut another one that size, and now I'm going to stitch these into little tubes. So I now have 2 little tubes. I'm going to fold it wrong side to wrong side to make my cuff. I'm going to put a couple of pins in, 2 to be exact. And at the moment I'm not worrying about the direction they're going in. I want to join or pin it so that the seam and the seam pretty much come out right. They don't have to be perfect. And at the other end, I'm going to pin them together there as well. So I'm pinning it in half. There. So that's going to be one of my cuffs. If I take one of my cuffs, and where I've pinned the halfway mark is on the inside, I want to match that up with the halfway mark on the sleeve. Put it together. And pin it there. I'm going to do the same where I've got my seam. I'm going to pin that to the seam. That just needs, when I'm sewing it, to be stretched enough to meet the sleeve. And I need to be careful because I don't want to accidentally go over a pin, so I'm going to put it the other way. And then I'm going to just sew that in there. I'll start just before all of these seams, and initially I'm not trying to stretch things. The needle is now in the the fabric, and that means I can stretch it. So I come out here to where the other pin is and stretch it out, stretch the cuff out to meet the sleeve. So I went about 1/4 of the way around the sleeve there. Now I'm getting to the halfway point, trying to make sure I keep all of these edges together. Now I'm coming to the halfway point on the other side, finding all the bits and stretching them out just a little. Cut off the piece of the thread when you initially started. I can get these pins out now. And you need to sew back over where you got to the beginning of the sewing and then veer off. That sleeve end is finished now, except I've got to do something with this chaining piece. And there are a few ways you can do it. You can get a little hook and pull it through the overlocking here. If you know what you're looking for, I'm looking for the 2 threads that are going through the middle of the chain. I am going to pick up those 2 threads and pull them out, and then I'm going to knot them together. Three times for luck. And I can trim off those threads. And there is my cuff. It's just very slightly smaller than the sleeve, which means that it won't, as it gets washed, it won't hang out and be bigger. And it's completely finished off that edge without me needing to use a sewing machine. If you wanted to avoid using a sewing machine for the hem, you could do effectively exactly that kind of cuff, but make it bigger and do it around the bottom edge of the shirt. You probably need that much shorter on the cuff than on the shirt in order to make sure that it doesn't end up too loose. Maybe a bit more. Something you might have to play with. But it is possible, if you're trying to avoid using the sewing machine, to do it completely on your overlocker. For my hem, I'm going to start at my centre back seam, but you could start wherever you like. I'm going to overlock, and I'm going to take my differential feed down a little bit. So essentially I'm stretching this just a bit. Go in, the same as I just did with the cuffs. And the reason I want to have the differential feed down is I want this to be stretchy. I don't want the machine to be stopping this part of it from stretching. The very last thing I needed to do was get the sewing machine back out, fold the hem up and stitch it with a long straight stitch. I like to do the hems on my t-shirts about 1¼ inches or 3 centimeters wide. In doing that, there's enough weight in the hem that it doesn't want to fold up. I find it works well. And here's my finished t-shirt. The shirt fits me fine, and that's the effect you get with cuffs. They're not tight, but they are tighter than the sleeve. In total, this shirt took me less than an hour to make. Extra was required for the filming, but really, making t-shirts doesn't take all that long at all. Hope you enjoyed it. See you next time.